we ended up going to China to actually secure a drug we couldn't get in trials and is still sadly not available today in the United States, but is FDA approved.
There's this perception that, once we exhaust these things, then go to trials. Like this idea that all trials are third, fourth, fifth line. But the reality is some of the best trials we know that have made it through phase 1 and 2, meaning they've demonstrated they're safe, they've demonstrated they're effective. Now we think they're the best thing that there is. I think many providers don't know it, that once you get a dose of treatment, you are now excluded from first-line trials forever. Navigating clinicaltrials.gov is a nightmare. It's a nightmare for the patients, it's a nightmare for the providers.
Welcome to Cracking Cancer, where we tackle the tough questions about cancer with real patients and world experts. Our mission is to empower the cancer community through education, bring transparency to the oncology system, and drive funding for critical cancer research. Whether you're facing a diagnosis, supporting a loved one, or simply here to learn, we're here to bring clarity, hope, and action to the fight against cancer.
Hey everyone, welcome to Cracking Cancer. I am your host, Dr. Kyle Concannon, and joining me today is Max Doppelt, and today we'll be talking about exclusionary criteria for clinical trials. Max, maybe you can take a sec and introduce yourself and why this topic is particularly relevant to you.
Thanks for having me, Kyle. This is a really important topic for myself and my family. My mom was diagnosed with lung cancer about 2.5 years ago. And after she went through the standard of care treatments, our family turned to clinical trials as her only option. And at that point, there were a number of trials that seemed like the right fit, but actually getting onto one of those trials was a whole different ballgame. And she was, after several weeks of screening, we actually failed screening and were rejected from one of the trials. And that was a really hard thing for our family to carry, that burden. And out of that experience, I decided to launch a platform to support patients, help take a bit of that burden off when searching for trials and understanding what trials are the right fit and understanding the full picture of the exclusion criteria.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard your story, I've heard your mom's story. And as someone who runs clinical trials and helps patients navigate clinical trials, it definitely tugs on a heartstring. Do you want to dig into that story a little bit more granularly? And we'll leave institutions and names out of it, but just maybe as a cautionary tale for people who are navigating clinical trials, understanding what that process is like and where some of the pitfalls might be.
Yeah, sure thing. When my mom was diagnosed, we jumped pretty quickly into chemo and immunotherapy. And actually, later on, we learned that her specific cancer was quite unique. She had an EGFR Exon 20 mutation, which is about 2 to 4% of non-small cell lung cancer. And at the time, there were no standard of care drugs that were approved that would target her specific type of cancer. But there were several that were in clinical trials. And those trials were exploring new drugs because they'd be more effective than the current standard of care. And that was really important when taking care of my mom and for caregivers taking care of their loved ones. They want to get the best access. They want the access to the best possible therapies. And it's rewarding to the amazing scientists like yourself who are developing these therapies to get them into patients' hands. And when things do go sideways and you don't get access to that drug, when you understand the clinical benefits, it's heartbreaking. And we had to kind of go outside the system, and we really traveled all over the world. And I told a story on this podcast. We ended up going to China to actually secure a drug we couldn't get in trials and is still sadly not available today in the United States, but is FDA approved. And my mom has been on that drug for over 17 months. And when comparing to the standard of care that was available at that time, the prognosis was way worse. So the impact was hugely on my family and really motivated me to think about how I could help and support other patients through this journey.
Well, we really appreciate all you've done, and I appreciate you telling the story because it is a really impactful story. And the fact that you've all had to go out of country to get something which eventually is even approved here and we still can't get here speaks to some of the barriers that we have in our system. And I think the elements of your mom's story that really resonated with me when we were thinking about this topic was the fact that many people don't know clinical trials are really set up to be an experiment and we're supposed to be answering a certain question. And like every experiment that we run either in the laboratory or with patients, we want to minimize variables. We want to make sure that the answers we get, we can interpret and then generalize to the greater population. And the reason I bring that context up is because there will be very clear criteria in a clinical trial of who can be in this trial and who cannot be in this trial. And those criteria are not always, one, immediately obvious. It's not intuitive that someone would have chosen these things. And two, when you're the person who's looking for clinical trials, a lot of times us in oncology, us providers will say, oh, there are clinical trials that target your thing, your mutation that you may have, or some particular nuance about your cancer. But we rarely go into, are you exactly fitting the criteria for that trial? So I think a lot of times we'll be hopeful and optimistic about someone having access to what we believe are, life-saving or life-improving medicines. But then when you get to the pragmatics of can that actually happen, sometimes there can be a really big disconnect there. And many of the time it's around these exclusionary criteria for a trial. So I think maybe before we jump in further, Max, what's your understanding of exclusionary trial criteria?
Well, the trial, like you said, is experimenting a new drug, and they need to test that that drug is safe. And they do that in earlier phase trials. And then later, as they go, they want to test at the proper dose, that it's effective, that at a larger set of patients, that there aren't unintended effects that would be harmful for patients. So a key aspect of the trials is to protect the patients. And around exclusion criteria, they're clearly defined. And for the trial that we were rejected from, there was a criteria around pneumonitis, that risk of pneumonitis could cause adverse effects for the patients. But my mom didn't have pneumonitis. What she had were signs that could indicate pneumonitis. So some of these exclusionary criteria are not binary. It's not so black and white, and it's really this gray area that needs to be navigated. And that's a huge part of the platform I've built, which is surfacing for all of these known exclusion criteria, like around pneumonitis, what steroids has the patient been on, or what is being shown in a CT scan. If we could surface and make transparent all of this information, we had to wait several weeks to find out that she failed screening. That could be expedited significantly, and that would take a huge burden off patients and the pharmaceutical companies and doctors and PIs who are exploring these drugs as well.
Yeah, I think incredibly well put. And for those who don't know, the pneumonitis that you're talking about, what that is it's inflammation in the lung. And usually when we're referring to that, we're thinking, did some treatment that this patient got cause inflammation in the lung? And even if it's a little bit, trials will often be very hesitant to put someone on study if they have a history of inflammation of different organs, because they don't want their drug to cause that same reaction. And sometimes that can even lead to death. So it is a real risk that people run if they have these histories. But then, the challenge for a diagnosis like pneumonitis is it's really hard to make that diagnosis. You have a CAT scan, you look, there's some area that's fuzzy in the lung. It's probably some inflammation, but what's it from? Is it from the drug? Is it from something else? We don't know. So a lot of times the trial is going to err on the side of caution. They don't want people in that they could potentially harm. And that really is a large priority for them, is to make sure they do no harm. But, that means that could be weeks of hemming and hawing or going back and forth with the person who's running the study, the pharmaceutical company or what have you, to say, would you consider this patient? Would you not? And in the meantime, the patient is in limbo and they're waiting for, am I going to be on this trial? Am I not going to be on this trial? Have I been setting up alternatives? A lot of times we'll screen for, maybe more than one trial at a time, but not everyone has access to more than one trial at a time, at least not in the same institution. So that ends up being really, really hard to navigate. But even just this idea that, oh, we have this cancer, or, we're treating this cancer and there are trials, the idea that exclusionary criteria are something to consider isn't something that everyone knows about. Usually the inclusion criteria your doctor is going to, have a general sense about, but a lot of times the we should probably do a different episode on inclusion criteria at some point because they can be very vast. But the exclusion criteria are usually why people that we think would be a good candidate for trials don't get on. Max, in your experience with Patient Data Vault, what are some of the common exclusion criteria that you've seen that prohibit people from going on a trial?
So usually in the space of lung cancer, it'll be common sites of metastases. So sometimes like CNS, brain metastases, things like pneumonitis, lab values, if their liver function, or if certain blood counts are not at the standard or what the pharmaceutical company thinks would be safe. Those are common exclusion criteria that our system surfaces from the patient's electronic health records in order to expedite the resolution process. And there are hundreds of conceivable criteria that we've seen over the course of thousands of trials, not just in lung cancer, but across cancers. And the quicker we can surface those criteria, the quicker patients can understand their next steps.
Yeah, and I think, one you mentioned here was brain disease. And that is a common one in clinical trials where if an individual has cancer that's spread, if it's spread to the brain, it's very trial to trial specific whether or not they'll let someone on if they have brain disease that wasn't radiated or what we call active. So, and it's a big challenge for us in the field because we have these therapies that we think work well in brain disease because many patients get brain metastases. But if no one's included in trials who had active brain disease, then how do we know? So that's one of the major issues. And the reason that trials will often exclude this, not always, but often, is that individuals who have active brain disease tend to do worse. So historically, the treatments we had didn't work in the brain. So the historical precedent was that we just don't include those people in trials because the therapy is not going to work there. The patient is going to do badly. Nowadays, we actually have a lot of treatments that do work really well in the brain. So we're pushing the field, we're pushing the pharmaceutical companies to allow people to include patients on trials that have brain disease as long as it's not causing a problem. So nowadays, a lot of times what that means is it has to be asymptomatic, meaning you're not having headaches, you're not having dizziness, you're not having weakness, those kinds of things. And usually it's not requiring steroids. A lot of times when the brain has tumor in it, you can get swelling. And that swelling can cause problems. It can cause symptoms, and people need to be on steroids. And that's a marker that, this person's brain disease is not, it needs something else soon. And if this drug doesn't work in the brain, we don't want them to do so poorly because they want to stay on the trial. So I think there's real considerations about brain disease. The strong challenge is that it varies trial to trial, whether or not they're going to allow brain disease. And usually my assumption is no. So a lot of times what we see and what we do is we'll see an individual who, maybe their tumor has a certain mutation. Great. We have this great trial that has a really promising therapy for it. We'll match them. But then if we find out that they either have new brain disease or the brain disease they had is worsening, we'll radiate that. And that can cause trial delays. So the other areas in the body are not getting treated during that time usually. They don't start you on trial and then let you do the radiation. Usually you have to do the radiation first. And that causes a big delay.
Those are common exclusion criteria I see as well, like washout periods from past therapies, or just the number of lines of therapy a patient has been on. If they are heavily pretreated, they could be excluded, especially in later phase trials, because of the unknown adverse effects that could come from either mixing multiple drugs or just the sponsor's concern that the patient may not perform as well when they're measuring the results of their study. And that's an area which frustrates me from the patient's perspective, because I wonder if we thought a bit more about what are the adverse effects from a patient not getting on a trial if they have brain metastases and could do well on this trial, and that patient then passed away 3 to 6 months later. How is that captured by the FDA or within our system? It doesn't seem to be captured right now. And I wish there was a way we could start to capture that so that we could then channel that into incentives for pharmaceutical companies to be a little more lenient and around their protocol design, along with thinking about compassionate use and expanded access programs as well.
No, you raise a great point there. And I think the way our trial system is set up, in my mind, is far too risk averse. And, I think if this were a trial system that were designed for, a topical treatment for a skin disorder, sure, this makes all the sense. You want to be really rigorous. You want to make sure it works. You want the science to be really, really tight. The challenge with oncology is, if you don't treat it adequately, the patient dies. And I get frustrated by some of these exclusion criteria, including the brain. I mean, every one of the criteria we're going to talk about, I'm going to have a beef with, because there's so many exceptions to where it makes no sense to have that exclusion criteria in there. But either there's a historical precedent or the data is cleaner, meaning you have a clearer signal to noise. You can more appropriately advocate for this drug to be approved. And that's the other flip side too, is drugs that are not approved don't help anybody. And so if there's something in the trial that they think may compromise the approval, maybe it is the right call, but I think getting in this nuance is really tough. And, the FDA should have a retrospective view to say, wow, they actually had a lot of patients in here who had high risk features like brain disease. Maybe we cut them a little slack, or we allow for some expanded analysis or something. But you mentioned lines of treatment, and I don't know that patients know about this particular consideration where given trials will only be accessible to individuals who have had certain number of treatments beforehand. And what we mean by that is some trials are only available if someone has never had anything before. And other trials are only available if someone has had one or a certain number of things before. And based on the type of disease you have, they may be very specific. They may say you have had to receive this specific therapy. I have patients right now who are in my patient panel where I have a really good trial for them, but they have to have received a certain standard of care medicine before I can put them on the trial. So then we put them on the standard of care medicine, even if they were progressing before. And then we see, did it work or did it not? We monitor really closely. If it didn't work, then we go to the trial. But you have to go through these hoops, and it's not clear to the patient ahead of time that this may be a consideration. I think the frontline trials, meaning trials for people who have not had treatment before, are particularly sensitive. And I'm going to tell you kind of an anecdote. This has happened to me so many times at this point, where an individual will come to me for a clinical trial evaluation. So they'll come to the University of Colorado where I work now, and we're a big trial center. So we have a bunch of trials, and many of those trials are frontline trials. So if you've never been on treatment before, you can be on this trial that will specifically target the thing that drives your cancer. However, what happens a lot is providers will make the diagnosis, get them on treatment as quickly as they can, and then they get a dose of chemotherapy, and then they come see me. And what that means for the patient is they cannot be on trial now. And I think this is something that people do not know. I think many providers don't know it, that once you get a dose of treatment, you are now excluded from first-line trials forever. It would be a very rare exception, to my knowledge, of a frontline trial that lets you get a different treatment first. And that's a very, very common exclusion that I see that people don't know about.
How do patients find out about those first-line trials? Because so often the conversation of clinical trials only comes up after standard of care options have been exhausted. So the first-line trials you've been involved with, how do people typically find out about them?
One of the key things is that they start their treatment at a trial center. For a lot of patients, if their first oncologist they see is not at a trial center, they don't run trials, the oncologist is going to do their best by offering the best treatment they have access to. And that's what they get, And then there's this perception that, once we exhaust these things, then go to trials. Like this idea that all trials are third, fourth, fifth line. But the reality is some of the best trials we know that have made it through phase 1 and 2, meaning they've demonstrated they're safe, they've demonstrated they're effective. Now we think they're the best thing that there is. They get to phase 3, and sometimes they may be in the frontline setting, and that's where you have access to them. But that is frequently not how it goes. And I think for me, I would love it if people got a second opinion at a trial center before they started treatment at all. And if you relay to the trial center that is near you, a place you're considering, hey, I'm starting chemo at this time or this day, or, I just want to know, do you have a trial available for me? They can hopefully try to expedite things just to answer that question. Because once you get that dose, you are no longer eligible for a frontline trial. I mean, this has happened to me, every week for the last several weeks, where someone has come in looking for trial options, but they just got a dose of chemo 2 days ago. And it's not clear to the provider, it's not clear to them that there are trials that they're excluded from because that happened.
Wow. And that's why with my platform, Patient Data Vault, it's so important to think of ways how to reach patients where the diagnosis happens, where diagnostics are being run on their tumor, and thinking about ways in the ecosystem that we could surface this information no matter
Yeah.
where the patient is, and we could actually help them in terms of travel and logistically understanding what options are nearby them is what the platform is designed to do. So the earlier we get to patients, the better I think the outcomes would be.
No, I mean, I totally agree. And the oncologists that are out in the community treating patients who are at rural centers or what have you, they don't have the time to be digging through, for all of their patients. And they're seeing many patients a day, many days a week. So they don't have time to dig through everyone and see what frontline trial is available at what center near me and how far from the patient is it and what's the inclusion exclusion criteria. They're just trying to get treatment onto patients so the cancer stops growing, which is reasonable, right? But if the patient had access to what clinical trial options were around, at the time they were diagnosed, well, then that moves the needle. Like then people can reach out to those trial centers right away and get access to frontline trials. Because the other element about trials is if you're on something that's working, the trial is not going to take you on. Like, let's say I was newly diagnosed and I have cancer that's spread, and I started chemo 2 weeks ago, and I go to evaluate for a trial. Well, if the trial puts me on that trial, they don't know if whatever benefit they see is from the chemo I got or from their study drug. So they really can't enroll me. So then you have to wait until you progress, and you have to have something measurable. This is usually how it works. Not 100% of the time, but usually. And those are the criteria that they need. And then you have to wait on a treatment that could be more toxic than what the trial would offer, or maybe less effective. And I think it's really important, and I'm not sure everyone fully appreciates this, but usually you get the most mileage out of your first treatment. Generally speaking, one way to think about it is each line of treatment works less effectively than the line before it. Historically, with chemotherapies, it was each line you expect to work about half as well as the one before it. So you really want to put your best treatment in the first line if you can. So the idea of, oh, you have a rare mutation or you have something there's a clinical trial for, but we have all these standard of care things here. Do these first and then you'll have trial options later. I challenge that. I think you want to get the best trial you can up front. And unfortunately, a major exclusion criteria is being on something right now.
Another common exclusion criteria I'm seeing, and I hope it doesn't eat into the inclusion criteria episode, because a lot of times it shows up as an inclusion criteria, the reverse, is around ECOG performance status.
Yeah.
And I have a lot of questions to understand from the physician's standpoint how they treat and assign ECOG performance status, because it is so impactful if a patient is a 1 or a 2, the degree of trials that are available to them are significantly different. So when you're treating patients and writing in their clinical notes, which our system will extract and then make relevant to the trials for that patient. What goes into that determination?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, the ECOG performance status is how we grade people's functional status, like how able they are to go through their life. And it's on a scale of 0 to 5. And I just pulled it up so I could read verbatim what they are. ECOG 0 is fully active, able to carry on all pre-disease performance without restriction. ECOG 1 is restricted in physical strenuous activity, but ambulatory and able to carry out light work, light and sedentary nature, like housework and office work and things like that. 2 is ambulatory and capable of all self-care, but unable to carry out work activities, and they're up and about more than 50% of waking hours. ECOG 3 is they're only capable of limited self-care, often confined to a bed or a chair more than 50% of waking hours. ECOG 4, completely disabled, cannot carry any self-care, and then totally confined to a bed or chair, and ECOG 5 is death. So the clinical trials want the most fit people in case there's an adverse event, and generally speaking, people who are doing better, who are more active, who are more able to carry on with their day, live longer. So I think for both of those reasons, they want to prevent harm, but they also want the patients in the trials to do well. For that reason, clinical trials usually are ECOG 0 to 1. What that is ECOG 0 again is fully active. You wouldn't know you had cancer. ECOG 1 is you may be a little bit off from where you were before, but you can by and large do everything you could do before you were diagnosed, provided it wasn't physically strenuous, which for most of us, ECOG 1 wouldn't change our day-to-day life very much. But once you get to ECOG 2, and what that is you're taking naps throughout the day, about half the day you're resting because of fatigue, because of other symptoms. Once you get to that level, most trials will not accept a patient. How we evaluate that in the clinic is I ask these questions directly. What percentage of the day are you up and about doing things? And and that answer has to be interpreted with nuance. Because if someone is 80 and their normal day is kind of lounging around, they're retired, and they, get up once a day and hang out with the grandkids or what have you, if that's normal for them, that's not a detriment from their previous performance status. So that would probably still be an ECOG 0. They could be up more, but they're not. Whereas if you have someone who is 35 or, 28, younger, fit, and they're confined to the chair half the day when otherwise they would be out running, well, that's a huge detriment. They're ECOG 2. That is a big change that's imparted from the cancer. So a lot of times we have to think about it relatively. Another example we might have is someone who has a history of a stroke. They can't ambulate. How do you interpret ECOG for someone who can't walk? And then you really have to benchmark it to what you think their standard of care or their standard of living was beforehand. And then there's also this nuance of, well, what element of that is from the cancer and what element is not from the cancer? I'll tell you, in lung cancer, a lot of times once we start treating cancer, people feel a heck of a lot better. That may still be a limitation to being on trial, but after your first standard of care treatment for someone who looks pretty debilitated, they might feel a lot better and then be able to get to trial at a subsequent line. So the ECOG is also really important because individuals who have ECOG 3 or 4, meaning you're confined to the bed or you're confined to a chair over half the time, those individuals statistically will live shorter with treatment. So if someone's really sick, an oncologist may say, you're too sick, the chemotherapy that we give will lessen your lifespan rather than lengthen it. And I would say that is probably some of the hardest conversations I've ever had to have, is when someone is too sick to get treatment they really want. One of the, I suppose, silver linings to the research that we're doing is a lot of the treatments we have now are really well tolerated, that I would feel safe even giving them to someone in the intensive care unit because the side effects are so well tolerated. But that's not true for every treatment.
The drug my mom is on right now, she's able to tolerate it significantly better than chemotherapy or immunotherapy. And there actually have been patients who I know have gone on to this drug, hospitalized and have pressure in their vocal cords and the tumors
Good.
shrink and being able to talk again. And so I think it all has to be a case by case basis. And when you have these defined rules, it kind of makes it fit into a playbook a little bit too much.
Yeah.
And that's where I wonder. There was another patient example where I saw that I did a trial search for them, and they had an ECOG performance status of 2 at their last appointment, but every other appointment that they had, it documented an ECOG performance status of 1. And I saw that the date of the appointment was 3 or 4 days after their chemotherapy treatment cycle. So the patient was naturally weak that day. And then they were just labeled with an ECOG performance status of 2. So I suggested to them, go back to your oncologist and say, I think my mom's an ECOG performance status 1, actually. It was just she wasn't feeling well from the treatment that day. And they did change it, and it actually changed their eligibility for trials. So how patients know to advocate for this for themselves is somewhat, I don't think it's spoken about enough.
Well, and I'll add the eligibility criteria is supposed to be at the time of enrollment. So the ECOG should be dynamic. I think it is accurate to say if someone is bedbound, they're an ECOG 3 or 4 after chemo. And that may give you pause about giving chemo again if they stay that way before you dose again. But the clinical trial folks should be looking at what you looked at and make the same conclusion you made. I can tell you, we have this conversation with them all the time, where they will look and they'll say, hey, I saw an ECOG of 3, and I'll make the same justification you made and say, oh, well, they just had chemo then. They recovered, and now they're a 1. And that usually is sufficient. Because, the treatment courses are so dynamic, things change over time, but the person enrolling in the trial is at that time. We get people who are diagnosed and they have brain mets and they have surgeries and they have all these things. You wouldn't enroll them in a trial then, but they do get to meeting these trial criteria. But this is one thing, the performance status is so huge. This is one of the things that an individual can do to increase their likelihood of being on trial and to increase their likelihood of living longer is to do things that will improve their function when they're really weak. So a lot of times that's strength-based training. So I recommend, my patients do strength-based training, 3 times a week. And it doesn't have to be crazy, but I want particularly the hips, being able to get up from bed and walk around. If you imagine your ability to do that now is going to be lessened by 70%, would you be able to carry your weight around if you were that weak? And so for a lot of patients, when they're wondering, what can I do? And, reading between the lines, a lot of times they're asking you about alternative treatments or, should they be on ivermectin? But really it's, I want you to be physically fit and I want you to work on the ability to getting up from a chair, strengthen your quads, your glutes, those kinds of things. Because that's going to be what determines whether you can get on a trial many times. Like that's at least one of the things that's within your control. Many of the other exclusion criteria are not in your control. But the performance status, how strong your legs are, is certainly within your control, and you can work on that.
So, really interesting point about the patient's eligibility for a trial is dynamic. It's a moving target. And when I think about designing my system, it's really critical that I'm able to account for that and understanding these nuances, because what we're evaluating for patients is their likely eligibility today, not weeks down the road if they were to then go and travel. So that is something I've always tried to highlight when it is a gray area, surface that information for a human in the loop to then be able to kind of assess, oh, maybe that was just an off day. And that's really important, I think, for when dealing with AI in general. This is a moving target, and the software that we build around it needs to account for that.
Yeah, and you mentioned also the exclusion criteria of lab values, of which there are many. You can think of any lab value that you can draw. if it's dramatically off, could be an exclusion criteria. A lot of times we see white counts, we see the kidney function. Blood sugar is also one that comes up a lot. But these are things that individuals can work on, like blood sugar. For a lot of patients don't think that, not being compliant with, and that's the term we use, that can lead to being disqualified from a clinical trial, but it can. I'm having this conversation with one of our trial liaisons now, and this is an individual who has a brain metastasis that needed steroids because there was swelling. Steroids cause blood sugar to spike. So they're looking in the chart, they're saying, hey, I don't know if this person's good for our trial. Their blood sugar's 300. And then I have to make the case, no, like give it we'll check back in a week, but they do need to see that go down. They don't want to enroll someone when the blood sugar is in the several hundreds where they can have adverse events just from the blood sugar. So these are the kinds of things that I think it's not immediately clear that you have to be in tip-top shape for many of these trials to be able to accept you onto their protocols. And I want to make sure that for the things that people have control over, that they are controlling those things. Liver function tests. If someone has, is struggling with alcohol, or they drink, a couple of drinks the night before they get their labs done, if we see your liver function tests being elevated because of some inflammation in the liver from drinking, that can exclude you from trial, or at least we're going to have to redo it again and make sure we knew what was going on. So those kinds of things happen all the time. But a lot of times, if we see that go back into a normal range, then we're okay proceeding as long as we're convinced, we have a reason for it and it's not from the previous treatment or there isn't something else going on.
It makes sense. It sounds like a lot of administrative work and back and forth that you and your team need to navigate, and how you, through all of this, keep the patient engaged and still willing to go on to the therapy. It almost becomes a challenge as a sales pitch.
It's really hard. And a lot of times, we have this treatment that we have in mind that we want someone to go on because it's, to our knowledge, the best thing that's out there. And, we'll pitch, I'll pitch it in a meeting to the patient and I'll say, we have this trial, here's how it works. Here's the dosing schedule. Here's why I think it's better than what else we could offer. And then the patient leaves and they don't hear anything for like a week. And a lot of times what's going on in the background is this conversation you and I are having right now. We're having with the trial folks. And we have the people that work at the university that are helping us enroll people in trials. And those people have to put together the data and send it to the pharmaceutical group that's running the trial and say, here are some criteria. You're going to notice this. We think this. Here's what we do about it. And there's a lot of communication that's going on in the background that no one, the patient isn't hearing about this. So from their perspective, like I heard about a trial, but then crickets. And the amount of back and forth is dizzying. And sometimes they, we're talking about exclusion criteria, but they also want to make sure that you have the thing we said you have. Do you have that mutation? Do you really have this amount of disease? Do you really not have brain mets? So they want to confirm all that stuff.
And how often can existing testing be transferred over? So if my mom got a foundation medicine NGS test 2 years ago with a confirmed biomarker and then progressed, does the trial need to redo the biopsy?
In many times, yes. Not all the time. For a lot of the newer medicines that are coming out that are a little more targeted, they may want to make sure that the reason you were resistant to the other thing isn't going to lead to resistance to this too. So I'll give you an example. Many times when there's a mutation in a gene or a protein, a different mutation can happen in a different protein, so the tumor doesn't need what you originally started with. So these are secondary mutations that come up. And if that happens, then the new drug isn't going to do anything. So they may want some form of testing to say you, one, have the mutation that we thought you did, and you don't have another mutation that will make you resistant to our thing. And that would be an exclusionary criteria. And we see that. I've had that specific exclusionary criteria for quite a few of my patients, actually. But figuring that out takes some time. You have to either do a blood test and believe the blood test. Not all the blood tests are accurate. You have to have a lot of circulating DNA for the blood test to be accurate. It detects certain mutations better than it detects other ones. The tissue is pretty accurate. So a lot of times we'll try to get both. And then whatever one results faster with results we believe, we'll submit and get the ball rolling. But this can lead to several weeks.
Yeah, the time in the waiting period for the patient is so tough because the disease is changing every day. And the longer you're waiting, new things could surface that could lead to another exclusion criteria happening.
Yeah, I think it's a real concern, when people are this is what I'm navigating right now too, is we've been trying to get an individual, a patient of mine on trial, and they need these certain things to make sure the organs are good. They need an echocardiogram. They need updated scans. They need all these things. And for this particular patient, these aren't that easy to get. So it's taking some time, and they're having to reschedule things due to transportation challenges. And, then we see some areas in the brain that have grown. And now we have to wonder, okay, everything else was fine. These areas in the brain have grown. They do accept, this trial does accept active brain metastases, but are they going to be worried that they see some growth now? And then do we have to radiate it? And then do we have to, do X, Y, and Z? So the delays can lead to more delays. And then the fear is that after months of dealing with this stuff, or months may be a little strong, maybe, 6 weeks would probably be the upper limit. And then they say, oh, now you have an exclusion criteria. And that is the biggest fear we all have. And a lot of times we'll have backup plans. But if it looks like a trial is proceeding, they meet all the eligibility criteria, and the patient wants to go on it, usually we are pretty confident that's how the plan's going to go. And then your backup plan is going to take time to get to as well. So the delays, it's one element in cancer treatment we don't always talk about. There's direct harms and there's indirect harms. And direct harms are, I thought you had this mutation, you don't. I gave you a treatment that doesn't work for you. It caused you toxicity, it didn't benefit you. That would be a harm. That would be a very clear harm. Treatment delays are also, in a way, getting at ways we harm patients. And it's not, usually I wouldn't put it at the fault of the provider, particularly knowing how challenging the system is. But it's another form of toxicity, I suppose, that we don't always account for, is how long might this take?
Right. And I wonder what the feedback loop between yourself running the trials and when you're seeing what exclusion criteria are happening to the sponsors, the people who are designing these trials, the pharmaceutical companies, how they design their protocols, like what goes into that process. I've heard from somewhere that there's a lot of copy and paste happening. And I wonder, is that something you've encountered before, where you look at this set of exclusion criteria and you think, well, why does this have to do with this drug?
Yeah, a lot of times it's precedent. What did people do before? What is standard? People want to put something in that's going to get approved to be a trial. And if you put something in that people are used to seeing, they're more likely to just approve it. Going back and forth to get your trial approved takes a lot of time. And in a competitive environment where 5 other companies already have their trials going, you don't want to deal with that. Your company may fail if you don't navigate your trial expeditiously. However, I will say a lot of times the company sponsors really are receptive to the boots on the ground. The biggest one I would say is the brain mets one. And we had a meeting with a big drug company yesterday, and we had this exact interaction to say, we noticed this trial doesn't include active brain metastases. They had to be radiated. Why? Like, your medicine, we know works in the brain. We're going to push you to remove that restriction. And they hear it. There's always a balance with the drug companies. I don't think they love to put in things that increase their risk, as you could imagine. But it also answers the question that's clinically relevant. I'll say, at least in lung cancer, many patients get brain metastases. So knowing whether or not you can use a certain medicine to treat them is really relevant, really important. But no, they're receptive. To make an amendment to an existing trial, really hard. So if you see a big trial that's in a bunch of different countries and a bunch of different states, the likelihood that they're going to make a change to allow something that they didn't allow before, I think is pretty unlikely. And it also really changes how they interpret the results if halfway through they change who they're accepting. So more likely they would continue that trial and then at some future point evaluate, the slight deviation, or just let the real world data take over and then they can evaluate it when people start using it. That's probably safer for them. So we see that a lot too.
There's a big distinction that I've come across when looking for the right data source. So how does a patient know what exclusionary criteria are for a trial? It lives in the protocol, which in the United States, those protocols are very protected, and the criteria are considered almost IP of the company conducting the trial. In the EU, and we use this for our website as a data source, they legally have to post all the criteria of the trial. And I wanted to get your take on this distinction between how the regulatory impact there and how it could impact transparency around the exclusion criteria.
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't have that appreciation because from the provider perspective, I get to see the full exclusion criteria. So I'm not used to sitting on the other side, so to speak. And I'm curious, when you look, do you just see the 5 major exclusion they may have and you don't see the other like 20 things? Is that what happens?
Yes, right.
Yeah. So it may be that a liver function test 2.5 times the upper limit of normal is not accepted. And I would say it's a balance between having the stuff that is pragmatic and captures 95% of people, and then the exhaustive list that is after that mostly we can navigate. But, I'll tell you, I don't see the harm in additional transparency. Like, I would rather give people more information and then have them bring it up with their providers to help interpret it. I don't know the etiology of that difference. Like, I don't know if they're intentionally withholding exclusion criteria because they want people to think they're candidates, and then more people will go to that trial. Yeah, what is your interpretation of why you think that difference exists?
I think the regulatory ideology was we wanted patient-friendly language to understand if at a high level they're the right fit for the trial. But in the US, we have super high screening failure rates as a product of that. And especially with the incorporation of AI and being able to adjudicate these criteria across the patient's medical records, there's a huge opportunity to introduce more transparency and patients to understand their viable options at their institution and all institutions that are obtainable to them. So my take on it would be that increasing transparency would be hugely beneficial to patients. And in addition to that, you could have regulations or requirements around human, like patient-friendly, readable criteria that someone could understand. But I think the way the EU does it makes sense for at least the service that I'm trying to provide and support patients.
Well, I think you raise a really good point. And with the advent of AI that people have access to, um, you could copy and paste the inclusion and exclusion criteria, the full, several pages of it, and it is several pages, into ChatGPT or Claude or whatever you're using. And then your most recent note or whatever, screenshots of your labs. And you can probably put those together and say, based on this, am I excluded? And it would at least give you a sense of things to talk to your team about. I probably wouldn't rely on that exclusively because of the nuances we were talking about. But I do think you can trust people with more information, and it would lead to better outcomes and not just confusing people. And their lives are at stake, and we should give people all the opportunities that arm them with what they need to be successful. But I do think, it's funny you're mentioning the intention behind clinicaltrials.gov and these kinds of resources. And I'm like, um, there's a certain quote that my wife likes to use, and it's like, don't attribute to malice what you could attribute to incompetence. Um, so it's like, I'm not sure they were even all that intentional when they were setting this up, as they just wanted a big database that had stuff in there. Um, I think the example, and I'm gonna get angry emails from them now, but the example of what, or the reasoning behind why they did that could have just been like, well, that was too many words. We didn't want to type that many words. Like, I would be equally satisfied with that being the answer. But navigating clinicaltrials.gov is a nightmare. It's a nightmare for the patients. It's a nightmare for the providers. And that's usually where we do look for trials, or we're on trials and we know other sites that have them. But by and large, it's clinicaltrials.gov. And I think that's why resources like yours are so critical, because I can't synthesize clinicaltrials.gov. And if we had to look at all the sites that have one given trial, are those accessible to the patient? Which ones are enrolling? And then how do you compare that versus the next potential trial? They're going to list, 50 trials, and a lot of them are phase 1s in solid tumors. That, sure, it's a trial, but is it really the best one paired to your tumor biology? Probably not. How are you going to differentiate that? I don't know. And I'll give you, another example. One of my patients messaged me earlier this week, and we were chatting about clinical trial criteria. They had a trial they were really interested in, but this patient has multiple mutations in their tumor. And I was, had to say, yeah, it's not on there, but I would be very surprised. We can reach out to this group, but I would be very surprised if they would let you on this trial because you have multiple mutations. And that's not even listed there. It's just, I know the trial folks, and I know the biology of the medicine, and it wouldn't make sense to treat that. But people are going on clinicaltrials.gov and other sites, and they're seeing these things, and it leads to hope. And I, it kills me when that hope is misguided. But again, a call for more nuanced tools.
I think that's well said. We try to provide a comprehensive landscape of the treatment options for a patient, and it's really hard to not cross the line of being misguided hope. And that's where having the up-to-date exclusion criteria, having the most up-to-date, well-documented patients' records, the better grounded in actual patient facts that a system could be, I think the better will perform. So having, whether it's regulation, whether it's how the hospital's sponsors, it seems that more transparency would benefit all parties here, because it's what a waste of time it is for you and resources for the pharmaceutical company to look at patients that aren't going to be a candidate for your trial.
Yeah, and I would say, if we were to match up any given patient for a trial that we think would be a good fit, most of the time they're not going to meet criteria for one reason or another, and we'll have to pivot to a different trial or something like that. And those criteria, we've mentioned some of the big ones, but they can be really nuanced. I had one patient not accepted for a trial because this trial used a VEGF inhibitor. It's a protein that works in blood vessels, and sometimes if you inhibit it, it can cause bleeding. And the tumor had too much blood vessel in it. And it was like, I don't know how you determine that. Like, what's too much? I thought it still would have been a good treatment for the patient, but I had no idea. Like, that came out of left field, that this was going to potentially be a exclusionary criteria for my patient. And but yeah, any hint of that was too much. Similar to the pneumonitis stuff, any hint of that, if they catch wind, they're really going to want to protect the safety of the trial. And I don't blame them for that, but you can know that ahead of time, And I think
Right.
that's one of the nice things about your tool is you don't have to go through 3 weeks of screening for your data output to say you have 2 mutations. This wouldn't be a trial for you.
Yeah. The transparency is key, and what I felt was missing in the process with my mom. It's look at a comprehensive picture of her past medications. Did she go on a steroid to treat possible pneumonitis? No. So she has this inflammation. What are all the things that could have caused that inflammation? And it was this weeks long of back and forth. And if the information could have been surfaced quicker and
Mm-hmm.
adjudicated faster, I feel we could have gotten to a different resolution. And that's the whole, I think, the main premise of the technology piece of the platform. I think patients need support. It's a huge burden to carry when kind of navigating these criteria and trials. So really, how can we support patients is most important. But transparency is, I think, technically what could be really impactful here.
Yeah, and I think the impetus will fall to the treating physicians to help interpret some of this stuff, and that's what we should be doing. I've had this argument where I would much rather spend my time going through a list of trials that the patient brought to me than the patient feeling totally lost and not, having any sense of what their next steps may be and feeling hopeless. So I love the idea of changing our visits to be us navigating options together. And right now, a lot of it is patients come in and they're appropriately afraid when they're progressing. They have no idea what next steps might be. And, um, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. I think patients coming in armed with identifying some options for themselves, maybe we do them, maybe we don't. But a lot of times it does add value, really. And even if it's just reassurance in what we were going to do and the knowledge of why we're not doing something else and learning more about the biology, that can provide solace too and provide a good sense of why you might be in good hands. All right. Well, I think we've covered a good amount of the exclusionary criteria here and then are waxing poetic about them.
Yeah, I got through my notes.
Oh yeah.
Emotional cries.
Yeah, no, it's a big frustration. The other thing I would mention is keep in mind that there are a lot of reasons one can be excluded from a trial. Do not be upset about being evaluated for multiple trials at once. And that may even mean multiple different institutions. It's very reasonable to do that. You have nothing, no duty to your oncology or your treating team. Your duty is to fight the cancer, and that is our duty too. And a lot of times it is through teamwork, and people fly for trials all the time. Sometimes you may have to do that and have that expectation that if you're going to get access to some of these things that are not mainstream yet, you may have to travel for them. It may not be worth it to do that for you, but that's also a conversation you can have with the treating team: is how much benefit do you think we're going to get? Is this one of those really exciting trials that everyone's talking about, or is this one that might move the needle a couple months if it's positive, and maybe it's not worth traveling every 2 weeks to come get infusions at a city you don't live in. So I think a lot of nuances here, but all very individualistic for the person who's going through it.
It's a very personal conversation, and that it needs to be a dialogue. And I think when you don't have the knowledge and you're going through it for the first time, what does that support system look like to have that dialogue? And I think it's amazing that you do that with your patients. It's really, really kudos to you.
No, and I think another element we haven't shout out yet is the patient advocacy organizations, which I think is kind of like crowdsourcing what reasonable good trials there are out there. I know you're involved with Exon 20, which is around a lung cancer mutation, and there are many. So there are many patient advocacy organizations, and you can type in whatever disease type you may have, and then patient advocacy organization, and you should get a list of things that are related to if you have cholangiocarcinoma or if you have lung cancer, if you have a brain cancer. You'll find a bunch of individuals who have walked a similar path, and they may know of promising trials, where they're at, treating physicians, those kinds of things. So that can also be incredibly helpful.
It was very helpful for me. and having a designated patient advocate. I would highly endorse all of the lung cancer advocacy groups that are really helpful.
Yeah. Well, great. I think this is it's about time to call it. Any last sentiments to the people, Max?
Nope, all good on my end.
All
Thank
right.
you for having me.
No, thanks for coming on and telling your mom's story again, how that led to Patient Data Vault. Where should folks go if they want to look more into Patient Data Vault?
You could search Patient Data Vault in Google and come to our website, data-vault.health, to learn more information about the platform. And we're always can contact me directly as well.
Well, hey, thanks so much for joining. And everyone, hopefully you enjoyed this episode and got something out of it. You can always learn more at crackingcancer.org and let us know what questions you have. All right, we'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Cracking Cancer. If you found this helpful, please like, subscribe, leave us a review, and visit crackingcancer.org for more information. Every dollar we earn goes directly to furthering the podcast and supporting vital cancer research. Because together, we can crack cancer.